the wailing grief of Woonga, the dog. "You said there was death here," whispered Howland, leaning close to his shoulder. "There is one who has lived here since the last plague," replied Croisset under his breath. "He lost his wife and children, and it drove him mad. That is why we came down so quietly. He lived in a little cabin out there on the edge of the clearing, and when I went to it to night there was a sapling over the house with a flag at the end of it. When the plague comes to us we hang out a red flag as a warning to others. That is one of our laws. The flag is blown to tatters by the winds. He is dead." Howland shuddered. "Of the smallpox?" "Yes." For a few moments they stood in silence. Then Croisset added, "You will remain here, M'sieur, until I return." He went out, closing and barring the door from the other side, and Howland seated himself again in the chair beside the table. 15 minutes later the half-breed returned, bearing with him a good-sized pack and a 2-gallon jug. "There is wood back of the stove, M'sieur. Here is food and water for a week, and furs for your bed. Now I will cut those thongs about your wrists." "Do you mean to say you're going to leave me here alone, in this wretched prison?" cried Howland. "Mon Dieu! Is it not better than a grave, M'sieur? I will be back at the end of a week." The door was partly open, and for the last time there came to Howland's ears the mourning howl of the old dog on the mountain top. Almost threateningly he gripped Croisset's arm. "Jean, if you don't come back, what will happen?" He heard the half-breed chuckling. "You will die, M'sieur, pleasantly and taking your own time at it, which is much better than dying over a case of dynamite. But I will come back, M'sieur. Good by." Again the door was closed and bolted, and the sound of Croisset's footsteps quickly died away beyond the log walls. Many minutes passed before Howland thought of his pipe or a fire. Then, shiveringly, he went to seek the fuel which Jean had told him was behind the stove. The old bay stove was soon roaring with the fire which he built, and as the soothing fumes of his pipe impregnated the damp air of the room he experienced a sensation of comfort which was in strange contrast to the exciting happenings of the past few days. At last he was alone, with nothing to do for a week but eat, sleep, and smoke. He had plenty of tobacco, and an inspection of the pack showed that Croisset had left him well stocked with food. Tilted back in a chair, with his feet on the table, he absorbed the cheerful heat from the stove, sent up clouds of smoke, and wondered if the half-breed had already started back into the South. What would McDonald say when Jackpine came in with the report that he had slipped to his death in the waterfall? Probably his first move would be to send the most powerful team on the Wekusko in pursuit of Gregson and Thorne. The departing engineers would be compelled to return, and then— He laughed aloud and began pacing back and forth across the rotted floor of his prison as he pictured the consternation of the two seniors. And then a flush burned in his face, and his eyes glowed as he thought of Mélisse. In spite of himself she had saved him from his enemies, and he blessed Croisset for having told him the meaning of this flight into the North. Once again she had betrayed him, but this time it was to save his life, and his heart leaped in joyous faith at this proof of her love for him. He believed that he understood the whole scheme now. Even his enemies would think him dead. They would leave the Wekusko, and after a time, when it was safe for him to return, he would be given his freedom. With the passing of the hours gloomier thoughts shadowed these anticipations. In some mysterious way Mélisse was closely associated with those who sought his life, and if they disappeared she would disappear with them. He was convinced of that. And then could he find her again? Would she go into the South, to civilization, or deeper into the untraveled wildernesses of the North? In answer to his question there flashed through his mind the words of Jean Croisset. "Monsieur, I know of 100 men between Athabasca and the bay who would kill you for what you have said." Yes, she would go into the North. Somewhere in that vast desolation of which Jean had spoken he would find her, even though he spent half of his life in the search. It was past midnight when he spread out the furs and undressed for bed. He opened the stove door and from the bunk watched the faint flickerings of the dying firelight on the log walls. As slumber closed his eyes he was conscious of a sound, the faint, hungerful wailing cry to which he had listened that first night near Prince Albert. It was a wolf, and drowsily he wondered how he could hear the cry through the thick log walls of his prison. The answer came to him the moment he opened his eyes, hours later. A bit of pale sunlight was falling into the room, and he saw that it entered through a narrow aperture close up to the ceiling. After he had prepared his breakfast, he dragged the table under this aperture and by standing on it was enabled to peer through. 100 yards away was the black edge of the spruce and balsam forest. Between him and the forest, half smothered in the deep snow, was a cabin, and he shuddered as he saw floating over it the little red signal of death of which Croisset had told him the night before. With the breaking of this day the hours seemed of interminable length. For a time he amused himself by searching every corner and crevice of his prison room, but he found nothing of interest beyond what he had already discovered. He examined the door which Croisset had barred on him, and gave up all hope of escape in that direction. He could barely thrust his arm through the aperture that opened out on the plague-stricken cabin. For the first time since the stirring beginning of his adventures at Prince Albert, a sickening sense of his own impotency began to weigh on Howland. He was a prisoner, penned up in a desolate room in the heart of a wilderness. And he, Jack Howland, a man who had always taken pride in his physical prowess, had allowed one man to place him there. His blood began to boil as he thought of it. Now, as he had time and silence in which to look back on what had happened, he was enraged at the pictures that flashed one after another before him. He had allowed himself to be used as nothing more than a pawn in a strange and mysterious game. It was not through his efforts alone that he had been saved in the flight on the Saskatchewan trail. Blindly he had walked into the trap at the Coyote. Still more blindly he had allowed himself to be led into the ambush at the Wekusko camp. And more like a child than a man he had submitted himself to Jean Croisset. He stamped back and forth across the room, smoking viciously, and his face grew red with the thoughts that were stirring venom within him. He placed no weight on circumstances. In these moments he found no excuse for himself. In no situation had he displayed the white feather, at no time had he felt a thrill of fear. His courage and recklessness had terrified Mélisse, had astonished Croisset. And yet, what had he done? From the beginning, from the moment he first placed his foot in the Chinese café, his enemies had held the whip hand. He had been compelled to play a passive part. Up to the point of the ambush on the Wekusko trail he might have found some vindication for himself. But this experience with Jean Croisset, it was enough to madden him, now that he was alone, to think about it. Why had he not taken advantage of Jean, as Jackpine and the Frenchman had taken advantage of him? He saw now what he might have done. Somewhere, not very far back, the sledge carrying Mélisse and Jackpine had turned into the unknown,